Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, yeah. So I think the main point that I really want to engage on with language and assessment and the multilingualism that comes with assessment and language is the discrepancy that comes between and the mismatch between the environment in which we learn and we teach and then the assessment itself. So what I've found in the student environment and in my own personal case, being someone that does really involve itself with different languages, is that we sometimes find ourselves surrounded in a singular learning and teaching environment language, where we're equipped with that language in all the different tools and the specific words and vocabulary that is expected of us in an academic sense. And then from there, we enter ourselves into an assessment period where we've given this opportunity to be able to communicate more effectively with the lecturer in the academic sense by having different answer languages. So for instance, more than just that came in the learning teaching environment. So then, yeah, I think that what happens then is we often find that even though this opportunity then exists, people can't actually enact and use this opportunity to the best of their ability, because they end up having to still rely on that learning teaching environment language because they're expected to answer with the vocab and the academic language that is expected. And that becomes an issue when we look at the way in which language is used in the assessment, that it's actually taken further back is where I feel the main issue comes. Prof Mbulungeni.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just share a PowerPoint presentation, not because I'm going to speak for hours. Let me just quickly get there. Sorry. I'm hoping you can see that.
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So this particular point struck me exactly as Jarryd just explained. And it's actually such a coincidence because at exactly this time I was also reading an article that kind of blew my mind, and that has kept me busy now for a while. And it's basically around this idea that academic language is nobody's home language, and I'm not entirely sure who said that. I'm sure Prof Madiba would be able to say, but I think the restriction on language use is felt particularly in assessment, and of course the situation is complex, as Jarryd explained. So what this particular article, and this is the link which I can send on if you're interested, is that it introduces the idea of racialized bilingualism, where we talk about bilingualism as if it can be any two languages, but in fact, if one of those languages isn't English, then it really isn't seen as a kind of a valid bilingualism. And so in this case, these authors argue that teachers evaluate learners only through what they can do in English. And of course, this is at school level. So at higher education level, the picture is much more complex. But as Jarryd has just pointed out, even in bilingual situations, the acknowledgement of other languages might not come through in teaching, and therefore it's fairly useless to then introduce it in assessment. And the argument that they make very strongly is that academic language is actually not an identifiable and a linguistically identifiable entity. And it, as they say, it remains impossible to define objectively. And we know that. We know that professors have different ideas of what academic language is. And in fact, it's sometimes very idiosyncratic. So the language that you use, even as a home language speaker of English, the language that you use in assessments might be not exactly what a particular professor would regard as academic language use. So there's a big problem there. So these ideas, my questions are, what do they say about a national language policy for higher education that insists on developing the academic register in indigenous languages, And I'm not arguing against that. I'm saying that maybe that's an idea that all bilinguals or multilinguals have mirror competencies in 2 languages. So that if they write academically in English, they can also write academically in Afrikaans. And that's not how multilinguals language use works. We actually develop competency in specific areas, and we use the languages in a way that serves us best. So if we talk about academic literacy development, I think we need to be more humble in what we mean when we talk about academic literacy development. And we need to make sure that we are not just merely imposing something subjective on our, or very personal and idiosyncratic on our students when we ask them to write in a particular language. Right, that's basically what I wanted to say. Jarryd and I agreed that we are going to briefly present our questions, the questions that we want the different groups to discuss, and just talk a little bit about the pros and cons. So those were our questions. I don't know if you, Jarryd, you want me to leave them up, or are you happy to just talk?
Yeah, you can leave them up. That's fine. Thank you. Would you like me to go through the 3 of them?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. So what we found is that with what we engaged on, there's a lot that comes around the information and the content, and we found that these 3 questions are similar enough, yet deal with as broad of a spectrum with the topic. So first question is, could we foresee the possibility of more flexibility when it comes to language use and assessment? Question 2 is, how ingrained are ideas of academic writing and of keeping languages apart? And the question 3 is, how can we promote multilingualism and diverse language use within the context of the academic proficiency required by all those parties involved within the assessment process? So personally, I found that with these questions, we're really addressing not just assessments from the perspective of a student, but also in the perspective of a lecturer, and those were involved within the academic marking and the academic review perspective of an assessment, which I find, and Prof Mbulungeni probably as well, is this is quite an important perspective, because it's well said and done requesting that students can have assessments written in language, but if they're not set, particularly by that lecturer who's examining the content in the particular language, and if the review is of a different standard, we find that then how is a proficiency requirement then looking from those perspectives?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. I think quite often lecturers say, okay, well, we'll have somebody else marking, I'll be marking in Afrikaans and this person will be marking in English. But that person did not sit in those classes, did not hear the emphases that the lecturer maybe made, did not hear the questions asked. And I think particularly with open-ended kind of papers, where the marking is more subjective, that you're going to start struggling. However, I do want to talk about the ideas of receptive and productive multilingualism, because I might not be able to write something academically in German, but I'm fairly sure I will be able to understand something written in German. Just an example. So I think our lecturers are sometimes a bit scared to acknowledge that they can actually understand far more than they can produce. So there is the possibility of one lecturer marking both English and Afrikaans papers, if those are the 2 languages at stake here. But I think we also need to be, as lecturers, we need to take responsibility for our marking, especially with open-ended, more subjective marking. I don't think we often share the assessment criteria with students. And for that reason, there is this perception, oh, there's a tick here and a tick there, and then I get 56%. Open-ended assessments, how did you arrive exactly at 56%? How does that work? You know, as a lecturer, I find that difficult to believe. So, so much more the students. So I think in that regard, if we are going to have more than one language in our assessments, we need to have whoever's also going to mark in that marking team be part of the classroom, and and make sure that the assessment criteria are shared with the students so that they know exactly how the marks will be allocated. I don't know, Jarryd, if you want to talk about, you know, using more than one language in a test or in an assignment.
Yeah, definitely. So I think what comes to play there is, as spoken before with the learning environment, if we're engaging in an assessment period, this notion of one language use during the period is something that Prof Walt alluded to earlier, where if we're expected to understand something in a language but be able to be comfortable enough to write in a different language, the notion that we can't almost switch between languages while writing is something that could improve and could address question 2 in particular, maybe of these 3 questions. But look at something where if you can't find the word, you get the closest word in a language that you are most comfortable to. And I think that could allow those, when engaging with the content and when actually trying to answer an assessment and fulfill the mark requirement, the worksheet assessment criteria that was mentioned, it's something that keeping to one language is something that can be quite difficult in those situations.
Yeah, I think this has to do also with people's perception, you know, that you need to keep your languages separate. And for multilinguals, that's especially in this kind of environment where you hear the languages all the time. There are circumstances where languages are kept strictly separate. I was told, for example, that people who speak Flemish, but who work in Luxembourg, kind of speak only French in Luxembourg and they speak only Flemish at home. So there's a clear separation. But in our circumstances, that, you know, those languages are present all around us. And I specifically remember one of my past students who said that she was heavily penalized for writing in it was life sciences or biology or zoology, I'm not entirely sure. No, it won't be zoology. Sorry, I can't remember. Where she didn't use the word sternum, you know, the breastbone. She didn't use that term in her answer. She put the Afrikaans term in inverted commas, and she was penalized for that. So those are the things that we're talking about. That you know, for multilinguals, sometimes the other language just comes quickly, and you are under time pressure during assessment. So, you know, why not use that word? And surely if a lecturer doesn't know Afrikaans, you know, just Google it. You know, it's not that difficult. So it has to do with tolerance, but it also has to do with this perception that we need to keep languages separate. And this is not just a perception among lecturers, it's very much a perception among students too, that I've seen in my research. So yeah, I think we need to talk more about flexibility when it comes to language use in assessment, and maybe you know, even if you think at higher levels, when students have to defend their thesis, if you have overseas examiners who only understand English, you've got 2 other examiners who may actually understand Afrikaans and who can do the translation. But we are so set on, you know, if we speak English, we speak only English. If we speak Afrikaans, only Afrikaans, that we don't want to tolerate the mixing, especially in assessments.